had a name, before the first breath of the first human being ever filled a set of lungs, before the stars were hung in their places and the oceans were told where their shores would be, there was a word. And that word wasn't just information. It wasn't a concept floating somewhere in the abstract. It wasn't a theological idea waiting to be organized into a system. That word was a person. And that person, before anything else existed, had been living in unbroken, uninterrupted, perfect communion with God. Not since creation, not since the beginning of time, but before it. In a place before there were places, in a moment before moments existed, in a love so complete and so ancient that it needed no beginning, because it simply always was. John doesn't start his gospel with a miracle. He doesn't open with a birth narrative or a genealogy. He doesn't begin with shepherds in a field or wise men following a star. He starts before everything and says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Whew. Now, if you don't understand why John starts there, if you don't comprehend or don't have the ability to feel the full weight of that sentence, you'll spend the rest of this gospel reading a biography when you should be reading a revelation. So that's where we begin. Not with miracles, not with ministry, not even with the man Jesus walking the roads of Galilee. We begin before all of that. We begin at the source. Welcome to Unlock the Word. I'm your host, Matthew Harvey, and this podcast exists for one reason: to go deep into the Word of God and come out of it more alive, not just more informed. Because honestly, there's a difference. The truth is, you can accumulate information about God your entire life and still feel like a stranger to Him. What we're after here is something more than that. What we're after is an encounter. We're after the kind of understanding that doesn't just change what you think, it impacts who you are. So we're working our way through the Gospel of John, and we're going verse by verse. And to be honest with you, we're not rushing. John wrote slowly, and I feel like you should read him slowly. The truth is, he's a theological architect. Every word he chooses is like a load-bearing beam or wall in a house. Every image he uses echoes backward through centuries of scripture and forward into the fullness of what God is doing in the earth. So in this first episode, we're going to focus in on John chapter 1 and verses 1 through 18. This section of verses is what most scholars call the prologue. And before we read a single verse, I want to take time to introduce you to the man who wrote it. Because you cannot fully appreciate what someone wrote until you take the time to understand who they were when they wrote it. So let's take a look at the man John, the Apostle John, and his gospel. Truth is, the Gospel of John is not a theological textbook written at a safe distance from the subject. It's the testimony of a man who was there, who walked the roads that Jesus walked, ate the meals that Jesus ate, watched the miracles happen in real time, stood at the foot of the cross, and even ran to an empty tomb on Sunday morning. And by the time he sat down to write this gospel, he had spent decades living inside the weight of what he had seen. Now, his name was John, but his Hebrew name was Yochanan, which, and I want to say that out loud because I think it matters, because it's what Jesus would have called him. Yochanan. That word in Hebrew literally means God is gracious, or the Lord has shown favor. It's interesting, that's the name his parents gave him before he even met Jesus, before he ever wrote a word of this gospel, before he ever stood at the foot of the cross. His name was already declaring something about the God he would spend his life proclaiming. He was the son of a man named Zebedee, who was a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee. His mother, Salome, was by most scholarly accounts the sister of Mary, and who was the mother of Jesus, which would make John the cousin of Jesus. So these weren't strangers. This was family. He and his brother James were working fishermen. They were not men between careers. They're not failed something else's looking for new direction. They were established. They had a boat, a business, and a father who employed and hired men. When Jesus called them, they were actually in the middle of a workday mending nets. And they left everything. Something interesting is actually something that I don't want you to miss about John. Because I think the church has sometimes softened him into something he really wasn't. Jesus gave John and his brother James a nickname after they began following him. That nickname was the Greek word Boanerges, which translates to sons of thunder. That's who John was in his early years. Intense, fiery. He was the one who came to Jesus and said, "We saw someone casting out demons in your name, so we told him to stop because he wasn't one of us." He was the one who asked Jesus if they could call down fire from heaven on a village that wouldn't welcome them. This man had some edges. This man had some opinions. This was not a gentle mystic. This was a son of thunder. And yet, somewhere in his years with Jesus, something happened to John. Something so deep and so transforming that by the time he had wrote this gospel, he no longer referred to himself by his name at all. In fact, he called himself something else entirely. He called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, some people read that phrase and think John is being arrogant. I mean, I would be right there with him. It's almost like he's saying he was more loved than the others. But I don't think that's what's happening at all. I actually think John, the son of thunder, the man who wanted to call down fire from heaven, had encountered the love of God so deeply, so personally, so completely, that it became the very foundation of his entire identity. He stopped defining himself by his family, his occupation, his religious heritage, or even his apostleship. He defined himself by one thing: that I am the one Jesus loved. And that shift from a performance-based identity to a beloved identity is not just the story of John's life. It's the theological heartbeat of everything he wrote. It's the thread that runs through every chapter of this gospel, and it is the thing that John most wants you to discover about yourself by the time you finish reading it. So, when was the Gospel of John written, and why does it matter? Well, most scholars place the writing of this gospel somewhere between 85 and 95 AD. That's roughly 55 to 65 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. This makes John the last of the four Gospels to be written. And by the time John sat down to write, 3 other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, had already been in circulation, most likely for years. Those 3 Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels. Let me introduce that word to you because it's worth knowing. Synoptikos, or the word synoptikos from the Greek, it meant seen together. And that's what synoptic means. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell the story of Jesus from 3 angles that largely overlap. Actually, about 80 to 90% of their content is shared. You can lay them side by side, seen together, and follow the same basic story from 3 different perspectives. John knew these Gospels existed. He had almost certainly read them, and he chose to write something completely different. And that's not a small detail. It's one of the most important pieces of context that you can carry into reading this book. So, what do those other Gospels have that John's doesn't have? Think about what is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that you will not find in the Gospel of John. The birth narrative, the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, the Transfiguration on the mountain, the parables, the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, the lost sheep, the institution of communion at the Last Supper, the Olivet Discourse. None of these are in John's Gospel, which is incredibly interesting. But think about what is in John's Gospel that you won't find in the other 3. The wedding at Cana. That classic conversation with Nicodemus about being born again. The woman at the well in Samaria. The raising of Lazarus from the dead. The long farewell discourse in chapters 14 through 17 that we'll get to eventually. And all 7 of the great I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the vine. John's not trying to cover the same ground as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's going underneath the story that they told to the theological foundations on which the entire story rests. You see, Matthew, Mark, and Luke answer the question, what did Jesus do and say? Whereas John answers a different question. The question of who is Jesus and what does his coming mean for the nature of reality itself? And the good news is that he actually tells us exactly why he wrote it. Near the very end of the gospel, in chapter 20, John steps out from behind the narrative and says this directly. He gives us the reason. He says, "These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Whew. Life. That's the word he uses. Not correct belief, not doctrinal precision, life. And the Greek word he chooses there is one we're going to keep coming back to again and again throughout this series, because it's central to everything John is trying to say. The Greek word he uses is zoe. And this is not the ordinary Greek word for biological existence or life. The Greeks had another word for that, bios, which is where we get the word biology, the study of life. Zoe is something different. Zoe is the divine, eternal, inexhaustible life that flows from the nature of God himself. It is the life that God is, not the life he merely has. And John says, I wrote this entire gospel so that by encountering Jesus in these pages, you would come into contact with that life. Not just information about it, not just a theological category for it, but the actual thing itself flowing into your actual life. John writes this gospel to be a vehicle of encounter, and he wrote it late as an old man, possibly the last living apostle, writing from the accumulated weight of 60 years of walking with the risen Christ. When John chooses a word, he has spent decades with that word. When he makes a theological statement in these pages, it's been tested in the fire of real life and real suffering and real encounters with the living God. So we should read it that way. Read it slowly. Let it be larger than the categories that we try to box it into. So let's take some time and read the scripture. We're going to start in John chapter 1 and read the first 18 verses. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave them the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me.' For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. God, the only Son, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." All right, let's get into the text. Start breaking it down. Starting with verse 1. In the beginning was the Word. 3 words, and the first thing you need to know is that those 3 words are not original to John. He borrowed them deliberately from the very first sentence of the entire Bible. Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." In Hebrew, the opening phrase of Genesis is Bereshit, in the beginning. It became so foundational to Jewish identity that the entire first book of the Torah is named after it, Bereshit, which we translate as Genesis. So when a Jewish reader in the first century saw John open his gospel with "in the beginning," they would have felt the echo of Bereshit immediately. Something deep in their memory would have said, I know this opening. I know what kind of story starts this way. And to be honest, that is exactly what John wants, because he's doing something deliberate and profound. He's reaching back into the very first sentence of Scripture and placing his gospel in a direct conversation with it. He is saying what you are about to encounter is not merely an addition to the story you already know. It is the story, retold, revealed, completed. Genesis 1 tells us the story of creation. John chapter 1 actually tells us the story of recreation. It's the same God, the same beginning, but now moving toward a new thing. Right? Genesis begins with God speaking the world into existence through his word. John begins with the Word himself stepping into the world he made. And the question John is answering is this: who was that Word? Who was speaking when God said, "Let there be light"? Who was present face to face with the Father before any of it existed? That's what verse 1 is answering. And it answers it in 3 statements that I want to take one at a time, slowly, because each one is doing enormous work. So let's start with the Word. Who he is and where he was. So take the step back. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The word John uses for word here in the original Greek is one of the most deliberate word choices in the entire New Testament. So let me introduce it to you properly, because understanding it changes how you read everything else that follows after. The word is logos. In the Greek philosophical world, mind you, logos was not just a word, it was the rational principle underlying all of reality, the divine reason that ordered the cosmos, the intelligence built into the structure of everything. Greek philosophers used this word to describe whatever it was that held the universe together, that gave it coherence, that made it make sense. When John's Greek-speaking readers saw him open with "in the beginning was the Logos," they would have recognized that word immediately, and they would have been startled by what he was claiming, because he was claiming that the Logos was not an abstract principle, but rather it was a person. But the truth is, John wasn't only writing to Greek philosophers. He was writing to people shaped by the Hebrew scriptures as well. And in that world, the Word of God would have been known as the Devar in Hebrew. It carried an entirely different set of associations. The word Devar, the Word of God in Hebrew tradition, is never merely speech or conversation. It's never just sound moving through the air. The Devar of God is active, creative, powerful presence. And God said it was so. When God speaks in the Old Testament, things happen. Reality changes. The dead come to life. The sea parts. The Devar of God creates, sustains, heals, judges, and restores. It is God himself in action. So John takes both of these worlds, the Greek philosophical tradition and the Hebrew theological tradition, and he says, everything you've been reaching toward, everything you have been trying to describe with those categories has a face. The divine reason that underlies all of reality, the creative word that sustains all of existence, it's a person, and his name is Jesus. And there's 3 statements that are made about the word in this verse. Number 1, in the beginning was the word. Notice what John does not say. He does not say, in the beginning the word came to be. He does not say, in the beginning the word was created. He uses a specific Greek verb, an, E-N, and it's kind of pronounced A-Y-N, so let's call it ain. The imperfect tense of the Greek verb to be, and the imperfect tense of in the Greek describes continuous, sustained, ongoing existence in the past. It's not a snapshot. It's not a moment in time. It's a state that simply kept being. The word was and was and was continuously, without beginning, without origin, already there, already existing, before time could even provide a context for his existence. This eternal pre-existence, Jesus is not a created being who attained divine status over time. He's not an elevated angel. He's not a human being so filled with God's Spirit that he eventually became something more. He is the eternal Son of God, fully, essentially, inerrantly divine. And there was never a moment when he was not that. In the second statement, the word was with God. The word with in the Greek is pros, which actually translated means face to face. That's what pros means. Not simply nearby, not in the same location, but face to face, turned toward, looking at, in intimate, direct, personal relationship with. The word pros, God, face to face with God, before anything else existed. Before creation, before the first moment of time, the Son and the Father were looking at each other, knowing each other, delighting in each other. I'll sit with that for a moment because it tells us something foundational about who God is that changes everything about how we relate to him. That means God was not alone before creation. He was not a solitary, self-contained being reaching outward in loneliness. Father, Son, and Spirit existed in an eternal, face-to-face communion of love, complete, overflowing, needing nothing. The theologians have a word for this inner life of the Trinity. It's called perichoresis. I'm probably butchering that, but it's the mutual indwelling, the divine dance, the 3 persons of the Trinity inhabiting one another in an eternal relationship of perfect knowing and perfect love. God was not lonely before creation. He was overflowing, and that overflow, that abundance of love that could not be contained, is the reason that the world exists. Not because God needed something, because love, by its very nature, expands. This is what it means that God is love. Not that God produces love as a function, not that God feels love as an emotion, that love is the eternal nature of who God is, and that nature was expressing itself in the relationship of the Father, Son, and Spirit long before you or I ever existed. Which means you were not created to fill a void in God. You were not created because God needed company. You were created as an expression of an overflow that was already complete. You came from a place of abundance, not from a place of lack. Okay, sit with that for a minute and think through this next statement, the third statement. The Word was God. Full deity, not a God, not a lesser divine being, not approximately divine. The Word shares the divine nature entirely. And this sits alongside the previous statement in a tension that's not a problem to be resolved, but a mystery to be inhabited. The Word was face to face with God, which means there is distinction, relationship, personhood. And the Word was God, which means there is essential unity, shared nature, and oneness. And then in verse 3 closes the thought by saying, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Everything. Not most things, not just the spiritual things, everything. Every galaxy, every mountain range, every ocean, every blade of grass, every human heartbeat, all of it came into being through the Word. He is not a character inside of the story. He is the author of the story. Let's keep going. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. 2 verses, and in those 2 verses, John gives us the entire arc of the human story, from creation to fall to redemption, in compressed poetic form. Let's break it down a little bit. In him was life, not from him, not through him, as a pipeline delivering life from somewhere else, but in him. Life was located in his person. The Greek word here is that word we introduced earlier, Zoe, the divine eternal life of God himself, resident in the person of the Word. And then John makes a move that should send us all the way back to Genesis 2, where he says, the life was the light of men. Now, to understand what that means, you have to understand what humanity was originally created to be. So go back to the creation account. God forms a human being from the dust of the ground, and then he does something he doesn't do for anything else in creation. He leans down and breathes into that human being his own breath. In Hebrew, that word for that breath of life is the word nishmat kayim. Nishmat kayim, the breath of life. That's not just air. It's God's own breath. The same breath that was in God breathed into humanity. And the result was a creature unlike anything else in creation. A creature made in the image and likeness of God. Designed to reflect the very nature of the one who made them. Lit from the inside by the life of God. That is what the phrase, the life was the light of men, means. When the Zoe of God is present and flowing in a human being, when the image is intact and the connection is unbroken, that person shines. Not with performance, not with religious achievement, but with the glory of the image of God, alive and present in human skin. Then the fall happened. And here's where I want to be careful and precise, because what happened in Genesis 3 is very often misunderstood. The dominant way most of us were taught to think about the fall goes something like this. Humanity broke a rule, incurred a penalty, and now God needs a payment before he can have relationship with us. That framework is not entirely wrong. There are elements of legal language in how the Bible describes the fall, but it's far too small. What happened in the fall was something theologians call an ontological catastrophe. So let me unpack that word. Ontological catastrophe comes from the Greek word ontos, or being. Ontological means it affected the very being or the very nature of humanity. Not just the record, not just the legal standing, but the actual substance of what humanity was. The image was marred. The breath was stifled. The zoe that was meant to illuminate the human soul went dark. This wasn't primarily a court case. This was a severing. The connection between humanity and the source of its life was broken, and every human being born after that moment has been born into a state of profound interior darkness, not just morally, but existentially. We were made to carry the light of God's image, and we are walking around in the dark trying to generate our own illumination. That is the human condition that John is describing in these two verses. The life is missing. The light has gone out, and all of human history since Genesis 3 is the story of that darkness and the story of the light moving towards it. Now, mind you, he says the light shines in the darkness. That's present tense, right now, ongoing, not past tense. Not the light shone once and then retreated. Present tense, the light shines. It is actively, continuously, presently shining in the darkness of the human condition. And then he says something even more powerful to me. The darkness has not overcome it. There's a Greek word there, and the Greek word is katelaben, from katelabano, or to seize, to take hold of, to suppress, or even to comprehend. So John is saying two things at once with this word. The darkness could not defeat the light. It could not seize it. It could not suppress it. It cannot extinguish it. And the darkness could not understand the light. It had no category for it, no framework that could contain it. All of the accumulated darkness of human history, the darkness of sin and death and broken identity and separation from God, looked at the light and had no answer. The darkness was and is utterly outmatched. The light cannot be extinguished by what it came to illuminate. That's not just poetry, that's a promise. And it keeps going. Now we're getting from that place to talking about a man named John. So there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to bear witness to the light. Which seems like kind of crazy to throw that in. But after 2 verses of soaring cosmic theology, John, the author John, the apostle John, pulls the camera all the way down to earth and puts a human being in the frame, a man named John. And the very first thing he does is tell us what this man was not. He was not the light. His name, Yochanan, the Lord has shown grace, was already announcing the message before he ever opened his mouth. But he himself was not the message. He was the pointer. He was a voice. I want you to feel the significance of that, because John the Baptist was not a minor figure in that culture. He was drawing enormous crowds. He was the center of a genuine spiritual awakening. People were traveling from all over Judea to hear him preach, and he'd be baptized in the Jordan River. There was real momentum around his ministry, and the religious establishment in Jerusalem was paying close attention. If we're honest, nervous attention. And in the middle of all of that momentum, all of that attention, all of that influence, this man's entire identity was defined by what he refused. He refused the crown the crowd was ready to put on his head. He refused to become the center of what God was doing. When they came and asked him directly, "Who are you?" he said, "I am a voice." Not a title, not a role, not a credential, a voice. A sound in the wilderness existing for the sole purpose of carrying a single word in a single direction. Well, there's a principle here for anyone who teaches, leads, or opens their mouth in the name of God. The most dangerous thing that can happen to a ministry is when it becomes a destination instead of a road. When people gather around the teacher and stop there, instead of being propelled through the teaching toward the one the teaching was always supposed to be pointing at. John the Baptist never made that mistake. The success of his ministry was not measured by how large his following grew. It was measured by how completely he handed that following off to Jesus. So now let's talk about the tragedy part of this verses. Next part of the verses is, he was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive them. Read those two verses again slowly, because there's a quiet devastation in them that I don't want you to just skim past. Think about this for a moment. The one through whom the entire universe was spoken into existence stepped into that universe, and it didn't recognize him. He came to the people who had been shaped by centuries of his covenant love, who carried the scriptures that bore witness to him, who had been prepared by law and prophecy for this exact moment. And the majority of them looked at him and said, "This is not what we ordered." The question is why? Well, it's because they built their entire theological picture around a God who would vindicate their group, defeat their enemies, and reward their religious performance. They were waiting for a warrior king who would make Israel great on the world stage. And Jesus walked in revealing something completely different. He walked in as a revealing of the Father. A God whose defining characteristic is not wrath to be managed, but love to be received. A God who was not primarily interested in managing a moral ledger, but in restoring his image in the people he had made to carry it. And that God, a God of radical, reckless, unconditional love, was deeply destabilizing to people who had structured their entire identity around religious performance. Because if God's love is not the reward of our effort, then your effort is not the source of your security. And if that's true, the whole system that they had falls apart. And that's why they didn't receive him. Not because the evidence was insufficient, but because what he was offering required them to let go of something they were holding on to with both hands. This is not just a first century problem. Every generation produces people who have domesticated God into something that confirms what they already believe and validates what they already do. Every generation, Jesus walks into that and offers something better. We're in verse 12 now. And this single word might be the most important word in the passage. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. But the door was not closed. The invitation was not retracted. For every person who looked at Jesus and said, yes, even imperfectly, even trembling, even with more questions than answers, to those people, he gave something extraordinary. Not just forgiveness, not just a cleared record. He gave them the right to become tekanateo, children of God. Not servants of God, not subjects of God, not even just followers of God. Children, beloved ones, sons and daughters who carry the family likeness. People who belong to the Father, not because they earned it, but because they were born into it. And this is the word John reaches for. Tekna, children, because it is the most intimate word available. It is the word that describes the relationship you have with a Father who knew you before you knew yourself, who loved you before you loved him, who calls you into your truest identity, not as a reward for what you've done, but as a gift given in advance. And verse 13 tells us how this birth happens, right? Born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. This is not something you can arrange for yourself. Not through your family heritage, not through your own desire or effort, not through anyone else's intention for you. This is God's doing, pure and unilateral. And this is where I want you to linger for a moment and say something about salvation. I think the Western church has significantly undersold. When we talk about salvation, most of us were handed a framework that goes something like this. You sinned, there is a penalty. Jesus paid the penalty. God's justice is satisfied. You are forgiven. And when you die, you go to heaven. And there is truth inside that. I'm not dismissing it. But it's so much smaller than what John is describing here. He's using a word for salvation in Greek that's the word soteria. It comes from the root sozo, which means to save. Yes, but also to heal, to make whole, to restore to full health and function. The earliest uses of the word in Greek literature referred to a doctor bringing a patient back to complete health. Not just treating the symptoms, but restoring the person to the fullness of what they were designed to be. That is what salvation is. It is the Father healing the wound that was opened in the fall, restoring the image, returning the light, bringing back the Zoe that was lost, making whole what was broken. Not eventually when you die and finally get to heaven, but beginning right now in your actual life today. Friends, the truth is you're not saved from something into a waiting room. You're saved for something, for the restoration of the image of God in you And that process is beginning now. All right, let's keep going. The next verse. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Whew. The Word became flesh. In Greek, there's a couple words here. Kai ho logos sarx egnito. 4 words in Greek, and I want to spend some real time with each part of what that phrase is, because it is without question the most staggering theological statement ever committed in writing. The eternal Logos, the one who was face to face with the Father before creation, through whom every atom of the universe was made, became sarx, or flesh. And I need you to understand that in the ancient Greek world, sarx is not a flattering word. It's not a neutral word for body. It carries the full weight of what it means to be finite, dependent, limited, exposed, vulnerable, mortal. It is the word used for creaturely reality of embodied existence. The hunger, the fatigue, the capacity for suffering, the mortality. The eternal Son became sarx, not pretended to, not appeared to, not maintained the divine nature while temporarily borrowing a human costume, became fully, completely, with nothing held back. He knew what it was to be hungry, not philosophically, but with the specific, urgent, physical reality of an empty stomach after 40 days without food. He knew exhaustion, not conceptually, but in his actual muscles after a day of walking dusty roads. He knew grief, real grief, the kind that produces actual tears, as we will see in chapter 11 when he stands at the tomb of Lazarus and weeps. He did not lower himself into humanity reluctantly, holding his nose, tolerating the messiness of embodied life so he could complete his mission and return to where he really belonged. He entered it fully. And the reason that matters is this: what God became, God can redeem. I'll say it again. What God became, God can redeem. The incarnation is not separate from the work of salvation. In the most fundamental sense, it is the work of salvation. By taking on human flesh, the eternal Son united the divine nature with human nature in his own person. He brought back the Zoe, back into the flesh, and everything that followed, the ministry, the miracles, the death, the resurrection, was the outworking of that union. Now, look at the word John uses for dwelled. Eskenosin. Pitched a tent or tabernacled. The root of this word is skine, or tent, tabernacle. And if you know your Old Testament, this is going to do something to you. In the wilderness, after the Exodus, God gave Moses precise instructions for a portable tent sanctuary, the tabernacle. And when it was built and consecrated, the glory of God filled it, a cloud by day and fire by night, resting on that tent in the middle of the camp. The whole nation of Israel arranged itself around that presence. Everything faced the tabernacle. Everything was oriented toward the place where God dwelt. The Hebrew concept for that manifest glorious presence was the term Shekinah, from the same root of the word for dwelling, the Shekinah glory, the visible, overwhelming, beautiful presence of God inhabiting a specific place. And so now John says, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, pitched a tent. The same presence, the same glory, the Shekinah has moved. It is no longer filling a tent made of fabric in the middle of a desert. It is now filling a body of flesh and blood, walking through villages, sitting at tables, touching lepers, weeping at tombs. God pitched his tent in a human being, and his address has been humanity ever since. That's where we get this next verse. And we have seen his glory, John says. This is the first person, plural, we. This is personal testimony. This is John, the old man, writing from the end of a long life, saying, I was there, I watched it happen, I saw the glory of God move through a human life for 3 years. And what I saw was this, full of grace and truth. 2 words that deserve to sit right next to each other for a moment. So let me take them one at a time. Grace in Greek is described as the word charis, which is described as a gift freely given, not a transaction, not a reward, not an exchange, not something triggered by performance, pure generosity flowing from pure love. It's unearned, it's undeterred, inexhaustible. And when John says Jesus was full of charis, he means the love of God that flows through him has no off switch. There is no version of you that exhausts it. There is no failure that depletes it. There is no distance you can travel that outruns it. Come on. It just keeps coming. Truth, in the Greek, is another word. And it comes from the Greek philosophical tradition that literally meant unconcealment. Reality revealed as it actually is. Nothing hidden, nothing performed, nothing masked. The truth of a thing is the truest self, fully exposed to the light. So when John says Jesus was full of truth, he means what you see is what was actually there. There's no performance, no diplomatic softening of reality, but also, and this is crucial, no cruelty in revealing. The truth he brings is in service of the grace he carries. Meaning grace and truth in the same person at the same time, inseparable. This is what it looks like when the image of God is fully present in a human being. Not frightening severity occasionally softened by warmth. Not permissive kindness that looks the other way from reality. Grace and truth together, moving through the world in human skin. What the cross actually is. I want to stop here and say something about the cross, because what John shows us in verse 14 reshapes how we understand what happened at Calvary. For centuries, the dominant framework in Western Christianity for understanding the cross has been legal. The idea goes like this: God is a righteous judge who cannot overlook sin. Sin creates a debt that must be paid. Jesus came and paid that debt by absorbing the punishment on our behalf so that God's justice is satisfied. And now he can love you. And there is truth in that framework. The cross is real. The debt is real. The payment is real. I'm not here today to dismantle the cross. But here's what that framework misses. It makes love a consequence of justice rather than the source of it. It describes a God who was not loving you, but who was actually in a position of wrath towards you until the legal problem was resolved. And then once that debt was paid, he could finally love you. But John 1:14 will not let us read the cross that way, because John says that the Logos became flesh, full of grace, full of charis, before the cross, full of unearned, undeterred, inexhaustible love of the Father, already moving through the world in a human body. The love was not contingent on the cross. The cross was the expression of a love that had always been there. The cross is not what the Father did to the Son so that he could love us. The cross is who the Father is, demonstrated through the Son. It is the fullest possible historical expression of a love that will go all the way into the darkness, into death itself, through the worst of the world, and come out the other side still saying, I love you. The cross is not the payment that makes God love you. The cross is what love looks like when it goes all the way. The next verse says this, for from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. From his fullness we have all received. The Greek word John uses for fullness here is pleroma, the complete, total, unreduced whole thing, not a portion, not a dose calibrated to your current level of spiritual maturity, but the full, undivided, inexhaustible life of God available. And from that, the pleroma, John says, we have all received grace upon grace. The Greek phrase is karen ante karitos, literally grace in the place of grace. One wave of grace gives way to the next wave, which gives way to the next. Not a reservoir that you drown in as you go down or draw down as you use it, an ocean that never stops coming in. You're always receiving more grace than you have yet been able to receive. The supply side is never the problem. The Father is not rationing his love towards you, releasing it incrementally as you demonstrate your readiness for more. It's pouring out continuously without measure. I want to be careful as we talk about this next part, because the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. I want to be careful here because John is not dismissing the law, the Torah, the divine instruction given through Moses. He is saying it was holy, it was good, it served a real and essential purpose. And in the Hebrew tradition, Torah is not primarily a system of rules. It's divine instruction for how to live in alignment with the nature of God. It showed the people of God what the image of God was supposed to look like, lived out in human life. It pointed the way. It held the community together, and it kept Israel oriented toward the one they were waiting for. But the law came through a servant, however faithful, however significant, a servant, and it had a limitation built into its very nature. It could show humanity what the standard was, but it could not give humanity the power to meet it. It could diagnose the condition, but it could not cure it. It could point to the gap between humanity as it was and humanity as it was made to be, but it could not close that gap. Grace and truth came through the Son, not through a system, but through a person. And what the person brought was not just a clearer picture of the standard, but the actual power to be transformed into the standard. Not through greater effort, but through a new kind of life, the Zoe of God himself, flowing into the people who were made to carry it. Wow. Now we're at that final verse. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's right hand. He has made him known. No one has ever seen God. not Moses, who came closer than any human being ever had, sheltered in the cleft of a rock in Exodus 33, while the glory of God passed by. Not the prophets, who received visions and words at the burning of edges of the divine. Not the high priest entering the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh, on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. No one has ever seen God. But then that final line of the prologue, he has made him known. The Greek word there is exegesato. He has unfolded. He has led out into the open. He has brought into full visibility what was previously hidden. This is the root of our English word exegesis, the careful work of interpreting a text or drawing out of meaning that was always there but needed to be made plain. Jesus is the exegesis of the Father. He is the Father brought out into full visibility in human form. Everything that was true about God, the love, the grace, the truth, the relentless pursuit, the overflowing abundance, the face-to-face intimacy that the Father has always wanted with his image bearers, all of it is now walking around in a body where you can see it, touch it, watch it, move through the world. Everything that you thought you knew about God before you saw Jesus, hold it loosely. Because Jesus is the correction of every distorted picture of the Father that fear and religion and human imagination have ever produced. He is the Father made known. And what he makes known is not a judge waiting to evaluate you, not a deity managing a transaction, not a distant sovereign requiring careful management. He makes known a Father who has been pursuing you, who knows you in your hidden places, who has been saving the best wine for exactly this moment, who sees you not as the sum of your failures, but as the image he is in the process of restoring. Let me bring all of this all the way home. John, the son of thunder, the man who became the beloved, the last living apostle, writing from the end of a long life, gave us 18 verses before the story even begins. And in those 18 verses, he told us everything we need to know about who Jesus is and what he came to do. The Logos was with the Father before creation. In him was Zoe, divine life, and that Zoe was the light of men. Humanity was made to carry that light. The fall extinguished it, and the Logos became Sarx and pitched his tent among us, full of charis and atreia, bringing the pleroma of God's fullness into human reach, making the Father known with his very life. Here's the thing I need you to carry out of this episode. Most of us were handed a gospel that is primarily about the removal of penalty. You sinned, there's a consequence. Jesus paid the consequence. God is satisfied. You are forgiven. When you die, you go to heaven instead of somewhere else. Believe it, pray a prayer, and you're in. What I want to say to you one more time, there is a truth in that. The penalty is real. The payment is real. The forgiveness is real. But the soteria, the salvation that John is describing in these 18 verses is so much larger than that. It is the Father reclaiming his image in the people he made to carry it. It is the Logos becoming Sarx to bring Zoe back into human beings who were made to be illuminated by it. It is the wave after wave of charis ente charitos, grace upon grace, working its way into you, not just to forgive you, but to restore you and to bring you back to what you were made to be, to make you look more and more like the one whose image you were fashioned to bear. You are not saved from something into a waiting room to get to heaven. You are saved for a purpose. You are saved for union with the Father, for the restoration of his image in you, for life, Zoe, real, full, divine, present tense life flowing through you and into the world around you. Not for when you die, but now. That is the Gospel of John, chapter 1. And we are just getting started. I want to thank you so much for spending this time in the Word with me today. I mean that. And if this episode connected with you, I want to invite you to share it. Send it to someone who's hungry for something deeper. Do me a favor, leave a review on Spotify, because it genuinely helps other people find their way to this table. New episodes are going to drop every Monday and Friday, and we are going verse by verse through this Gospel of John. And I promise you, it only gets richer from here. Episode 2 is coming on Monday, and we are heading into the banks of the Jordan River, where a man who can't stop pointing away from himself introduces the world to the Lamb of God. And then Jesus turns around and asks two men following him the most important question they have ever been asked. What are you looking for? I hope you tune in and don't miss it. Until then, stay in the Word. Stay in the Word.